Setting: Hollow Ridge, New Mexico Territory, 1873. High noon. The sun hung overhead like a curse. It burned the dust until the air shimmered, and the wind dragged grit like it meant to peel skin. Every shutter in Hollow Ridge was open, every neck craned. They'd heard the sentence. They came for the show. Sheriff Wade Boyd, thick around the middle, with a badge more rust than shine, leaned against the rail in front of the dry goods store, chewing tobacco and spitting like it was just another Tuesday. His boots were propped, hat tilted, a whiskey bottle resting in the crook of his arm. Across the square, tied to the whipping post, stood Eloise Granger. Her white blouse was already streaked with blood. Brown dust clung to the sweat on her forehead. Her lips were cracked, but she stood tall, proud, like a flag refusing to be lowered. She was only 19. A trembling gasp rolled through the crowd as the town's deputy, barely more than a boy, lifted the whip again. Whhh crack. The leather tore skin. Her knees buckled, but she didn't scream. She bit her tongue until she tasted copper. Women in the crowd looked down, some clutching rosaries. Others held their children close. The men mostly turned their heads, murmuring about how she should have just said yes. But Eloise had said yes once. Then she met Elias Boone. Elias Boone was the kind of man who never walked. He loomed. He stood behind the crowd now, arms folded, scowling beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A man of wealth, age, and menace. 3 dead wives behind him. No children, just cattle, coin, and a reputation like smoke. Thick, choking, and impossible to pin down. He'd gone to Eloise's father with an offer. 10 acres, 2 mules, a well already dug, all for her hand in marriage. Her father, drunk, broke, desperate, agreed. Eloise didn't. She refused, loudly, in front of the whole church. She told Elias Boone, "I'd rather dig graves with my bare hands than be your 4th wife." The town had no jail for women, no court that listened, but it had Sheriff Boyd, and Boyd was always for sale. Elias accused her of slander, defamation of a respectable man, he said. Boyd called it disruption of a lawful engagement. And now the girl was bleeding in the sun while the town nodded and muttered about manners. And then came the sound of hooves. A single horse, dusty and gaunt, rode down Main Street like a ghost cutting through fog. The rider was tall, narrow-shouldered, with eyes that had seen war and worse. A man carved from Loss. Levi Shaw. He wore no gun at his side, only a hunting rifle slung across his saddle. His coat was sun-faded. His boots were patched. His face was quiet, but something boiled just beneath the surface. He wasn't the sort to stop in town. He rarely came farther than the blacksmith's forge. Folks knew his story. A rancher who lost half his herd in the drought and his wife in the fever. He hadn't been to church in 4 years, hadn't smiled in 6. But now, Levi Shaw pulled his horse to a halt and stared at the girl on the post. Their eyes met. Just for a second, something passed between them. Not pity, recognition. He swung down, walked forward. The crowd shifted uneasily as he passed. He didn't rush, just moved with the certainty of a man who no longer feared death or damnation. "Enough," Levi said. The word cut through the murmurs like a blade. Silence settled. The deputy froze mid-swing. Sheriff Boyd straightened. "Now hold on, Shaw. This here's lawful punishment." "Lawful don't mean right." Elias Boone stepped forward. "You got no part in this, Shaw." Levi turned, slow and deliberate. "Don't I?" Elias sneered. "She refused her betrothal. Lied about me in front of decent folks. Her pa signed a contract. She's not a mule, Boone. Can't trade a woman for land and call it love." Boyd took a swig. "You interrupt a lawful sentence. Levi, I'll marry her." The words dropped like thunder. Gasps rose from the crowd. A woman fainted. Eloise's eyes widened. She swayed, her lip trembling. Sheriff Boyd squinted. "What did you say?" Levi looked only at Eloise. "I said, I'll marry her. Right now. Nullifies any other claim, don't it?" Boone exploded. "She's mine by deal." Levi turned to him. "You want to fight over a woman you had to buy? Or you want to walk away and pretend you ain't been shamed?" Boone's hand twitched near his coat. For one long second, the entire street held its breath. Levi's rifle, still strapped across his back, might as well have been a cannon. The old rancher's pride cracked, loud and ugly, but he didn't draw. He spat in the dirt. "She ain't worth the rope to hang her." He turned, barked to his men, and stomped off. Sheriff Boyd shrugged and tipped his hat. "Guess that settles it." Levi stepped up to the post. His hands were calloused, but gentle as he untied the ropes. Eloise collapsed into his arms. He caught her, carried her like something sacred. The crowd parted. No one cheered. No one stopped him. Not because they agreed, because they didn't dare stand in the way of something that felt like justice. They rode out of Hollow Ridge together. She bled into his shirt. He didn't mind. She whispered his name once before sleep claimed her. And Levi Shaw, who thought his heart had died with his wife, felt it beat again. Not with love, not yet, but with purpose. And that was something. Setting. Levi's ranch, Badwater Hills. Late summer, 1873. The hills around the ranch were bone-dry, their outlines jagged against a washed-out sky. Cracked earth stretched for miles. The nearest neighbor was 10 miles of dust away. Wind carried no voices, only the creak of broken shutters and the occasional moan of thirsty cattle. In this quiet, Eloise Granger came back to life slowly. Levi had carried her across that porch like a soldier bringing home the fallen. She was feverish, delirious from the pain. The lashes on her back were deep, crisscrossed like a map drawn in blood. He'd cleaned them with boiled water and crushed aloe. She never made a sound. For the first 3 days, she barely moved. She slept in his bed, face down, while he took the floor by the door, rifle within reach, just in case Boone got brave. He cooked beans and coffee, slid bread under the door of silence she'd built, never asked questions, never looked at her when she turned away. He knew the look in her eyes. He'd seen it before in soldiers who lived but left something behind. On the 5th day, Eloise stepped outside. Her feet were bare, her steps uncertain. She walked into the small patch of dry earth behind the barn and knelt among the dead tomato vines. She didn't cry. She just started pulling weeds. From inside the house, Levi watched through the kitchen window. He didn't call out. Just let her be. She worked until her fingers bled. They spoke in fragments after that. "More beans," he'd ask. "Please," she'd whisper. Sometimes she hummed old songs while hanging laundry, soft lullabies with no words. Sometimes she flinched when Levi entered a room too fast. She still avoided mirrors. She still slept with the blanket pulled high over her shoulders. But something was changing. She planted new seeds. One night, the sky turned black and cracked open. Rain came hard, sheets of it, the kind that drums on rooftops like Judgment Day. The wind slammed the barn door. Lightning ripped the horizon into shards. Levi found her crouched in the corner of the kitchen, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking. "Eloise," he said gently. She didn't answer. He crouched beside her, keeping his distance. "It's just thunder. Just weather." Her eyes were wild. "Don't let him find me." "Boone." She nodded. He reached out, palm up between them. "He won't. Not here." Her fingers trembled before sliding into his. She looked up at him, soaked in moonlight and fear. "Why did you marry me?" He was quiet for a long time. The fire cracked. Rain whispered against the walls. "Because I couldn't let the town break you, like it broke everything else." Her eyes welled. For the first time since that brutal day, she smiled. It wasn't big, but it was real. The next morning, Eloise made breakfast. Just eggs and old cornbread, but it felt like a feast. She didn't speak much, but she sat at the table, ate with him, drank the coffee. Later, she found an old book on the shelf, Wuthering Heights, its pages water-warped and faded. She read under the cottonwood tree while Levi worked the fence. They were still strangers in many ways, but no longer strangers to kindness. That week, they talked. She told him how her mother had died bringing her into the world, how her father had called her cursed ever since, how the other girls in town only looked at her when they wanted something, braid tips, sewing help, silence. She told him how Elias Boone had followed her from the general store to the church, how his hands lingered too long when he tipped his hat, how her father had taken the offer without asking her, how Sheriff Boyd had called her ungrateful when she said no. Levi listened, eyes steady, never interrupting, never judging. Then he spoke, told her about Cassie, his wife, how she'd loved sunflowers and whistled while brushing her hair, how she'd died in spring fever with their newborn boy in her arms, how Levi buried them both on the hill beneath the single elm and hadn't whistled since. He told her about the drought, how he sold his best Mares to buy feed, how the barn nearly burned one summer, how he stood on the porch one night with a rifle in his lap and thought about ending it all. But then, he said, I saw the moon break through the clouds, and I figured maybe something's still worth saving. Eloise reached across the table and touched his hand. The next morning, she kissed his cheek before heading out to the garden. A week later, she kissed his lips. There'd been a wedding already, hasty, silent, done in front of a sleepy circuit judge who barely looked up from his papers. No flowers, no ring, just 2 signatures and a witness borrowed from the jail. But now, under the wide breath of desert sky, they said different vows, not with words, with hands calloused from work, with silent glances shared over coffee, with the way Levi always walked on the side of her that faced the wind, with the way Eloise covered his shoulders with a blanket before he nodded off by the fire. They were not a love story, not yet. They were something older, worn, earned. In the quiet of the Badwater Hills, among the ghosts and the cracked land, something unexpected took root, tender, unspoken, and strong enough to survive the next storm. And both of them, scarred and stitched together by circumstance, began to believe, maybe, just maybe, they deserved more than survival. Maybe they deserved peace. Setting late fall. Levi's ranch, Badwater Hills. Morning frost curling on dead leaves. The wind had changed. The smell of burnt sagebrush drifted through the air, and the sun was slow to rise. Levi noticed it first. How the birds stopped singing. How the cattle turned their heads toward the hills like they could feel trouble coming before it crested the ridge. He and Eloise were in the yard, mending the fence with stiff fingers, chilled breath curling like ghosts in the morning air. Eloise wore a wool shawl over her shoulders and a knife strapped to her thigh now, not out of fear, but readiness. The thundering of hooves cut through the stillness. They both turned. 5 riders appeared over the ridge. At the front rode Elias Boone, stiff in the saddle like a man who'd been chewing on vengeance for weeks. His shotgun hung lazily across his back, but it was the look in his eyes that warned Levi he wasn't here to talk. Eloise took a step back. Her hands trembled, but she held her ground. Then slowly, she stepped behind Levi, her fingers brushing the back of his coat. Boone pulled his horse to a halt, eyes narrowing as they took in the little homestead, modest, weather-worn, and somehow still standing. I come for what's mine, Boone barked. Levi didn't flinch. She's not yours. Boone tilted his head. Law says otherwise. No, Levi said evenly. You had a deal with her father, not with her. No vows, no church, no consent. What you had was a lie. You don't own her, Boone. Never did. Boone chuckled, low and bitter. He spat in the dirt. You think a broken-down rancher and a whipped girl can stand against me? The riders behind him shifted, guns resting on their hips, glancing at each other like they weren't sure why they'd agreed to ride out here in the cold for a petty grudge. Levi didn't answer with words. He cocked the lever on his rifle and pointed it at the ground just in front of Boone's boots. Boom. Dirt exploded. Horses whinnied and reared. One rider fell. Boone didn't flinch, but his men did. The tension snapped like a whip. Levi stepped forward, shoulders square. You want to test your manhood, Boone? Try me. Right here. No backup. No lies. No guns. Just two men. Boone's jaw tightened. He dismounted. His boots hit the ground hard. He took off his coat, tossed it aside, and cracked his knuckles. She should have been mine. I gave that worthless father of hers everything. That land, those mules. You bought livestock. You don't get a woman in the bargain. Levi snapped. They circled. The air hung heavy. Dust kicked up around their boots. The other riders formed a loose perimeter, eyes wide, uncertain. Eloise watched from the porch, hands clenched, a small blade hidden in the folds of her skirt. Boone lunged first. A punch. Levi dodged it, barely. Boone's fist scraped his jaw, but Levi stayed up. He retaliated, one to the ribs. Boone grunted. They exchanged blows, raw, desperate, full of history neither man fully understood. Boone fought like a man trying to reclaim pride. Levi fought like a man defending something sacred. Blood bloomed from Levi's brow. Boone's lips split wide. They grappled, fell, rolled in the frostbitten dirt. Eloise's breath caught as Boone mounted Levi, fists raining down. But Levi twisted, grabbed Boone's arm, and slammed his elbow into the frozen ground. Boone howled. Levi rose, blood running into his collar, and landed one final punch square to Boone's jaw. Crack. Boone collapsed, groaning, defeated. Levi stood over him, breathing hard. He looked to the riders. Get him out of here. No one argued. Two of the men helped Boone up. The rest turned their horses around. They didn't leave out of loyalty. They left out of shame. Epilogue. Spring comes quietly. Setting. 6 months later. Morning sun creeps over the thawed horizon. Winter passed gently that year. Rain came early. Cattle birthed in twos. The old well never ran dry. And the seeds Eloise planted, those tomatoes, those beans, came up full and green. Levi stood on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, the horizon glowing gold. His jaw still had a faint scar from Boone's knuckles, but the pain was long gone. Eloise stepped behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist. She rested her cheek against his back, and for a while they just stood there, breathing in the spring air. Do you ever regret it? She asked softly. He turned slightly, enough to see her eyes. Marrying a girl I met at a whipping post. She gave him that crooked little smile she wore when she was trying not to cry. He touched her face gently. I regret not finding you sooner. She leaned into his chest. The wind moved through the tall grass, whispering like memory. In Hollow Ridge, people still spoke of what happened. Some with shame, some with awe, a few in hushed tones, pretending they hadn't watched a girl bleed in the street and done nothing. But far from the town's gaze, at the edge of the world, Levi and Eloise built something no town law could touch. They planted more. She wrote stories again. He sang under his breath while fixing fence posts. They walked side by side, equal weight, equal choice. And every night, under a sky wide enough to bury all the pain they'd come from, they laid their heads down in a house made not from lumber and nails, but from survival, from sacrifice, and from the grace of choosing each other. The scars didn't vanish, but they didn't rule them anymore. They had written their own law, not with bullets, but with love.